10 votes in the House that were just concluded. So we're resuming meeting number 92 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs, suspended on Monday, January 29th, 2024. We recognize that we meet on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. The first order of business we have today before we return to our clause by clause is that Madame Gill, who was the second vice chair of the committee, has been reassigned by her party. And so we've welcomed Monsieur Sébastien Lemire, and who's been appointed member of the committee on Monday, January 29th, following the adoption of the PROC Report 56. And so as such, the committee needs to elect a new second vice chair. I'm going to now turn the proceedings over to the clerk, who will lead the election of our new second vice chair.
Donc, conformément à l'article.
So, pursuant to Standing Order 1062, the second vice chair must be a member of an opposition party other than the official opposition. I am now prepared to receive motions for the second vice chair.
I would like to make the motion that Sébastien Lemire be the second vice chair.
Donc, il est proposé par M. Baptiste.
It's been moved by Mr. Baptiste that Mr. Lemire be elected as second vice chair of the committee. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the motion?
Merci, Miigwech. Merci pour la confiance.
Thank you for your confidence. I am really looking forward to this. And this will be critical for the future of Quebec and Canada, relations with First Nations. So I'm looking forward to a lot of constructive work. And Marilyn, my colleague who was here before me, also contributed a lot to this committee's working. Thank you.
Thank you. So, colleagues, we have our regular scheduled time would go till 6:30. We do have 2 hours of resources from the time that we start, which was a few minutes ago. I will check in. I know a few people have talked to me about evening commitments, which often happens when we're on the Hill. So I'll check in at 6:30 to see where we're at, if we want to continue or end at that point. But for now, we are going to continue where we were left off. And this was on the NDP 5. And so I don't think I'd had the chance, Ms. Idlu, to ask if you would like to move NDP 5. And if I did, we'll just get you to do it again. Oh, and I can talk for a minute until you're ready to take the floor. So we had, if you recall, there had been a CPC motion that would have not allowed this one to proceed, if I remember correctly. That one was not carried, and so this NDP 5 is in order. And so now, Ms. Idlu, if you're ready to take the microphone, I'll turn it to you if you'd like to move your motion and speak to it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our new Vice Chair, Sébastien. I look forward to working with you. When we were ending on Monday, I had started with proposing NDP 5, which I had guidance from Métis Settlements General Council on the wording of it, because they wanted to make sure that this bill acknowledges that there are other Métis settlements or collectives in Alberta, and that by wording it the way that they want in column 2 would help acknowledge that they are that they would still have their governance work that they can do as Métis in Alberta.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone want to speak to the NDP Amendment 5? Okay, Mr. Baptiste, we'll go with you first.
As an important part of this legislation is for the stakeholders to be able to define for themselves who is and who isn't part of them. We've heard from the officials and the technicians saying that nothing in this act would bind anyone who doesn't want to be part of this to be a part of this. I think it's important that we allow the stakeholders themselves to define their organizations and to not try to have a parliamentary committee define for them in the schedule. And the stakeholders that I've talked to are not in favor of any amendments to the schedule. And so for that reason, the government will be voting no to any amendments on the schedule.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Batiste. Next, I have Mr. Viersen, and then I'll come back to Ms. Idlut. And sorry, Mr. Viersen, I just have to point out we weren't able to do your sound check, and so we need, which is a requirement. We'll see if it works for interpretation, but please proceed. If I need to cut you off, though, it'll be because of the sound check. So I'll turn the floor over to you, and we'll hope that it works.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an approved headset, and I do believe that I've done the sound check before in my life, so I hope that I have it set up okay. I'll just continue talking until I get you a thumbs up.
Yeah, we got a thumbs up, so you're good to carry on.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Just like kind of in response to Mr. Baptiste's comments a little bit is around of course the people that are listed here would like this bill to go forward, but there are other people that are affected by this bill. We are all affected by this bill, regardless of how if he wants to say the stakeholders, but we're all stakeholders. All Canadians are stakeholders in a bill like this, and everybody in Canada is affected by this bill. And so I grant that he thinks that we shouldn't change it, but I would just like to hear a little bit from our officials around is the column 2, the Métis Nation of Alberta in particular, is that meant to be the comprehensive, like, final group, or are we going to have is there a potential for other Métis governments to be recognized in the future?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Viersen. And I neglected to welcome our officials back to the table. Welcome. I'll turn it over to you if you'd like to respond to Mr. Viersen's question.
Mr. Viersen, we have given an answer to this question several times, and there's nothing about the way that this bill is structured that will impose a governance system on another Métis government. The entities that we're speaking of in this bill and that we're proposing to recognize in this bill are well-defined entities with their own citizens. This is a bill about governance over their citizens. We have nothing further to add.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Idlut, you're next on my list.
Mr. Chair, I'm not finished yet.
Oh.
Okay, well, can I come back to you? You posed a question. The officials answered it. I'm just going to go through my list. I'll put you back on after Ms. Idlut. Okay, so I have you next on my list, Mr. Viersen. But Ms. Idlut.
That's a bit of a novel way of doing it, but sure.
Please proceed, Ms. Idlut.
Payanamik, just to respond to Jaime, just to remind everyone that the Métis Settlements General Council was not consulted in this bill. And I'm not saying that this would be saying who is part of a citizenship or anything like that. It's just an acknowledgement that when it comes to column 2, that Métis Nation within Alberta isn't the only Métis collective in Alberta. That's why my amendment tries to address it, to say it's not trying to help. It's not, in no way is my amendments making any changes to how membership would be defined or used or measured or anything. It would just clearly outline that there are more than one Métis Nation in Alberta.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Idlut. Mr. Viersen, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With all due respect, Mr. Shintz, the point of my questioning these things is because Canadians are watching from across the country, and it isn't clear to me that this bill doesn't affect folks that aren't Métis people that are not.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Métis Nation of Alberta.
Okay, just one second, Mr. Vierson. We're going to go to the point of order.
It's repetition. The question was asked, it was answered. This is just repetition, so the relevance of this, is there a new question?
Well, I'll go to Mr. Vierson and see if there is. It's your time to get clarification or some new content. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't get an answer to my question. The question is, is there not room, like Mr. Baptiste is saying, that we shouldn't amend this schedule because that is how the stakeholders, in his words, want it to be written. I am saying that there is a Métis government listed in column 1, Métis Nation of Alberta, and then the collectivity that it says in column 2 is the Métis Nation within Alberta. Now, that's kind of like a circular logic that happens right there. Maybe we're pursuing, both Ms. Idlau and Mr. Schmale, we're pursuing it in the wrong column. Maybe we're supposed to be pursuing it in a Métis. No, I don't know. This is right. But is there not? Could we not broaden it? Like I think that Ms. Idlau's amendment broadens the collectivity to be more. Now, perhaps where we're mistaken, and Mr. Shintz could point this out to us, is perhaps there just has to be an addition, and this goes back to a previous amendment that I had around putting the word add. Can there be additions to column 2 without additions to column 1? If that makes sense, Mr. Shintz.
So I'll turn to our officials if they're able to provide comment on that question.
So Mr. Baptiste has spoken to the conversations he's had with the Métis governments about the schedule of the bill. So I don't know that I need to speak to that at the moment, but I would like to just point to an amendment that was accepted by this committee previously, which was a non-derogation provision, specifically to set out that Métis collectivities that have not authorized these Métis governments to represent them, nothing in this act is to be construed as abrogating or derogating from their right of self-determination. And while I'm certainly happy to be corrected, Mr. Vierson, I understood that as trying to get at this same issue, and it was an amendment that was accepted by this committee.
I guess I still don't. The point that we're trying to make is that there are other collectivities or other governments in Alberta that aren't the Métis Nation of Alberta.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Once again, it's repetition. Same question. Same comments.
The floor
5 days. And there is a point of order that I can raise of repetition, and this seems to be repetition.
I would say, Mr. Vierson, we've been around this one. If you have new content to bring in to further the discussion, then that's great. But I'd say just if try to take us to a new point that we haven't discussed before. We've had your concerns answered now in a few places on this. So I'll leave the floor with you and just ask you to, try and get some new information in here, new perspectives, but we need to keep this moving and not just debating the same points.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, if I still don't like beyond. We've been going around this for a while, but just saying that. Just saying that Mr. Baptiste is saying that because the stakeholders, in his words, don't want this amendment, we shouldn't support this amendment. And I'm saying, well, that's not a reason. That's someone's opinion, but that's not a reason to not support this amendment. I'm prepared to support this amendment, and I would like some acknowledgement from Mr. Baptiste that this is a fair amendment, whether or not he's going to vote for it. It is a thing that we can do, right? I don't want to end up in a place where the law, the schedule as we pass it becomes like a logical error, right? And that is what I'm trying to get at with my questions is, will we end up in a logical error if we pass Ms. Idlow's? And that has nothing to do with whether the stakeholders like the amendment or don't like the amendment. Will we end up in a logical error if we pass Ms. Idlow's or previously Mr. Schmale's? So you can say, well, we've been going around this. That I'm trying to get at the logic of the situation, not people's opinion on it. And that's my question to the officials is, will we end up in a logical error if we pass Ms. Idlow's amendment?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vierson. We'll go to the officials for a comment on that question.
As we've said before, the terms that appear in column 2 right now are those that also appear in the related self-government agreements signed between Canada and each of these Métis governments in February 2023. So there is a logic to having consistency between those February 2023 agreements and the terms they use for these collectivities and the terms that appear in column 2.
Thank you for responding to that question. I'm going to go to Mr. Schmale, who's next on my list. And Mr. Vierson, if you have a follow-up, then just do the raise hand function. I'll get you back on the list.
Okay, just to clarify and probably build on what Mr. Vierson was saying, just to clarify, there would be no harm done other than potentially upsetting some of the stakeholders if we pass this motion. There would be no massive result in a negative fashion other than potentially people not liking it.
I would say, so one possible consequence or potential impact of changing the terms as they appear right now in column 2, as I said before, would be that there would be an inconsistency between these terms and the equivalent terms to describe each collectivity in the agreements with each MNA, MNS, and MNO that Canada signed with each of those governments in February 2023. So we'd be left with a situation where there are two different terms worded somewhat differently, slightly differently, very differently, depending on the amendments. And if there was some kind of challenge to how these might be interpreted, having two different ways of describing the same collectivity could create some confusion.
Okay, so do I still have the floor?
Mr. Schmale?
I'll go to...
Yes, but
I just wanted to add one thought, and I've added this, I've made a similar comment previously. I also understand that it would be inconsistent with the terminology used in a constitution recently overwhelmingly passed by 65,000 citizens of the Métis Nation of Alberta.
Okay. Do I still have the floor? Do I ask one question and come back?
Usually, we'll go with the line of questioning. With Mr. Vierson earlier when I took the floor, I actually thought he was done. His line of questioning is, there is a pause, and so that's why I moved on to Ms. Idlout. And I know Mr. Vierson wants to go back to his, so just in fairness, to close out this round, I'll go back to Mr. Vierson, let you organize your question, and then we'll try and, going forward, finish off a round of questions or clarification to keep it nice and straight. But I'll go to Mr. Vierson now and then come back to you.
Okay. I think
so. Mr.
Mr. Chair, I'll cede my time to Mr. Schmale, and I'll just get back on the speaking list.
Okay, Mr. Schmale.
He's a swell guy, he is. All right. Okay. So just so I understand, because I think I went off track here. We're mentioning the agreements now, but the other day we were talking about the agreements, and we were told it's, I think, to my memory, which isn't great all the time, that the agreements don't really matter all that much. It's more the legislation, but now we keep referencing the agreements. Maybe we can clarify that path, just so I understand.
So those agreements signed in February 2023 between each of these Métis governments in Canada are sort of precursor agreements to the treaty. That's how they are described within those agreements themselves. They're intended to be replaced by the treaties that will be given legal force and effect through this bill. So those agreements won't get force of law through this legislation, but they form the basis for continuing those negotiations with each of those governments and essentially give us a sense of the content of those treaties that will follow. So when I refer to those agreements as being relevant now, it's that they are contracts between Canada and each of these Métis governments. So regardless of whether they get force of law through this legislation, which they don't, there's still an existing agreement on the books between Canada and each of these governments where there's value in there being consistency in how the collectivities concerned in each of those are described.
Okay, I might have a follow-up, but I'm good now.
Mr. Viersen, you're next.
The crux of what we're trying to get at here, so I'm beginning to be convinced that perhaps I shouldn't vote for this amendment just because that the Métis Nation of Alberta is a Métis government, and then that Métis collective. I guess just to Mr. Shintz, could in the future, because we established that there can be additions to this, could there be an addition to column 1 and column 2 that said Métis of Cadotte Lake, and then column 2 Métis of Cadotte Lake? Could that addition happen at some point in the future for them to be recognized Métis government? And that's what we're trying to get at, is that, there are groups of Métis that don't want to be recognized by the Métis Nation of Alberta. Could you see that happening, or is this schedule kind of one and done, and there would have to be a whole new bill set of agreements and that stuff going forward?
Okay, we'll go to Mr. Shintz for response.
So thank you for the question, Mr. Viersen. I think the answer to your question is that theoretically, yes, there could be an addition, and the Métis of Cadotte Lake are an example. I would point to Section 20 of this bill, which would require consent from the Métis governments listed in Schedule 1. And so I think there's, in the absence of everyone arriving at that consent, another option would certainly be for there to be a separate bill that was co-developed with another Métis government that wanted to define for itself what self-determination and self-government should look like. And I just want to add as well, we've stated previously, any other Indigenous community has the ability to approach Canada and to seek to have those discussions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Carr, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to distill all of this down perhaps to its simplest form. Now I'm checking my own understanding. So here's where I think we're at. Some members of the committee are concerned that there are faults within the bill because it leaves out certain groups that they believe should be included. However, having said that, I think that we all agree that the governments listed in the bill as it stands now deserve to have this bill and deserve to have their rights met through the agreements that would come to force should the bill pass. So, unless I'm mistaken, if we all agree that this bill serves the purpose of adhering to the agreements with those governments, and that it's been established many times over now, that any other group will not be prohibited in the future from entering into an agreement the same way that these three governments had, as our lawyers and other witnesses and technicians, as Jaime calls them, have told us, then I see no reason why at this stage of our discussions we cannot move forward in support of something we all agree on, which is getting these three governments what they deserve, the rights that they are entitled to through these agreements, and then we commit as a group to perhaps correcting some of the wrongs of the way in which this legislation perhaps was brought forward initially before my time. And we have a conversation about how the groups that rightly Ms. Idlow, Mr. Viersen, and others have raised concerns about are absent from the conversation.
So to summarize, I don't understand why when we all agree that these three governments should have the rights trusted to them through this bill and the agreements that will ensue, that we should hold this process up when we know for certain that the process can be repeated again in the future with the groups that are currently left out in their view. So if I have summarized that in a clear, I hope, and articulate way, I hope it may lend some thoughtfulness to how we decide to approach this moving forward, because I feel as though at this stage it is becoming less about seeking answers and clarity and more about simple opposition to things that I think we all agree can be corrected down the line. So I simply wanted to add that commentary, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Next on my list, I have Mr. Schmale.
I'm good now.
Okay, Mr. Vidal's next.
Mr. Chair, my point is totally different from where we're at. So I don't know if I see another hand, if you want to finish that first and come back, or I can ask my question, whatever's easier for you.
I can drop you down to the bottom, and because I had some other hands on this discussion.
Mine's going to be a bit of a different discussion.
So I have Ms. Edlute and then Mr. Vierson. So Ms. Edlute, over to you first.
When we first received this bill, I think I was like a lot of other Canadians. I didn't know that there were so many different Métis collectives in all of Canada. Never mind that there were more than one in Alberta. So when I learned of the existence of the Métis Settlements General Council and how they were not consulted, how they were not included, when I thought there would only be one Métis nation within Alberta, I saw nothing wrong with this bill. I was probably as eager as Jaime has been to just push this forward. But because of the testimony that we've been hearing from First Nations, from other Métis, I also need to make it abundantly clear that I've not been filibustering just to delay this process. I've been asking questions because it's been demanded of me. I think that I've made it very clear that I absolutely agree that Métis have a right to self-government. And in this context of column 2, I am trying to help maybe get other Canadians also to realize that there's not only one Métis within Alberta. And by proposing my amendment to say that there are other collectives in Alberta, that there's nothing that's being diminished. There's no MNA's goal for self-government is not being diminished. If the Métis Settlement General Council wants to seek a similar recognition with a bill like this, this will help them even. And for me, when I hear the value of keeping things consistent between two documents, pedagogically, because of what I've learned in law school, I know how important that is. But when it comes to ensuring that as parliamentarians, we're recognizing that there's more than one Métis collective in Alberta, that we're going to have to make sure there's that acknowledgement in column 2, I just needed to make sure that I'm not trying to just make simple amendments, or that this is something that helps acknowledge, because out of my own ignorance, I didn't know that there was more than one Métis Nation in Alberta, and including that text, I think in column 2 will help actually to get more Canadians to realize that there may be the Métis. Maybe you already had them, I don't know, but that's not the point. So I just wanted to clarify that a bit more.
Thank you, Ms. Hidloot. Mr. Vierson, I have you next on my list.
Yeah, just to respond to Mr. Carr, like there is still, like, and perhaps I didn't necessarily realize this till Mr. Schitz pointed this out, but in section 20, just around the amendment to the schedule, is that the folks on the schedule have to, section 20 says that it is satisfied that the Métis government set out in column 1 or set out in column 1 opposite, that the information has been consented to, or the amendment or approval or removal. So that I guess is a bit of a challenge with the, like, I'm happy to leave. I think I'm happy to leave the schedule as it is, provided that there could be other groups added to it. But that isn't the case if section 20 is how Mr. Shin said it was. So perhaps we have to go back and have a look at that, because I had an amendment that would have said for put additions in there, and that we talked about that at that point in time, but we never had any discussion about the consent of, because we said, okay, additions are kind of alluded to in the word amend, because I wanted to put add, amend, or remove. But is there, so Mr. Carr, I just would hope for a response from you around just how do we rationalize that?
Well, I have Mr. Vidal next on my list, but do you want to, okay, we'll go to Mr. Carr and then we'll come back to
Sure.
Mr.
Thanks,
Vidal.
Mr. Vierson. Perhaps Mr. Shintz inadvertently created a little bit of confusion, with all due respect. I think perhaps the confusion is, and perhaps Mr. Shintz can clarify this, Mr. Vierson, it's not that consent would be needed by the groups, or by the governments rather, listed in this legislation for any new piece of legislation to come forward, which is what I'm suggesting they can do and we should be supportive of. What I'm saying is, or what he is saying is that for this specific piece of legislation to be amended to include those groups, that it would require consent of the governments in this particular piece of legislation. So in other words, the distinction is that this legislation, specifically with these three governments, could only be amended if those governments consented. However, it does not change the fact that, as we've said many times before, these other governments that you've referred to have the ability to come forward with their own legislation in the future that would not require, because it's independent of this legislation, it's a brand new piece of legislation, hypothetically, it would not require the consent of those groups, those governments rather, in this bill. I hope I've clarified accurately, perhaps, Mr. Vierson, where your concern lied, and Mr. Shintz, you can certainly comment on that.
That's absolutely correct, Mr. Carr. And you know, part of the reason for that is that this bill is about these governments and their citizens.
Okay. Mr. Vierson, I'll come back to you, or go to you now, and then continuing with this conversation, and then I have Mr. Vidal I'll put after Mr. Vierson. So over to you, Mr. Vierson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. There is I think 636 Indigenous governments or First Nation governments in Canada, and they are recognized in a similar fashion across the country. This bill sets out to recognize Métis governments. I get the government's interest, the Liberal government's interest, to have only three to deal with, because that makes it easier for sure. But the Métis of Cadott, the Métis of Fort McKay, and the folks from Lethbridge that we heard from, I can't remember what their names are off the top. they're going to be pursuing their Métis governance or Métis government. Would it not be effective to add them to this list in the same way we have 636 First Nation governments in this country, and they're recognized as First Nations governments, and that's pretty understood. I would assume that Métis governments, like for example, whatever is going to happen in Manitoba, would they not get added to this list in the future? Whatever happens in BC, would they not get added to this list, or are they going to be pursuing a totally separate venue, essentially, Mr. Shintz?
As the negotiator for the Manitoba Métis Federation as well, I can say that their intention is to have their own bill. There are something like 26 implementing statutes for self-government agreements and modern treaties that exist, and in general, they are specific to individual governments that have negotiated on their own terms and in a manner befitting their own vision of self-determination. These three governments have chosen to advance self-government together. We detail some of that history in the preamble and some of the negotiations that have led to this point. The intention of this bill is to recognize those three governments, and just to say one last time, other governments have every right and ability to come forward to the Government of Canada and negotiate similar recognition. That is, generally, they're not all generally put into one piece of legislation.
All right, thank you.
Mr.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, this is totally a different question. I was going to go back to something. I think it was Ms. Redmond that said, so I'm a bit of a process nerd, so you tweaked a question for me. I just want to understand, okay? You said that these agreements are the precursor to the treaties that are contemplated, to the treaties that are contemplated that this legislation actually gives or are given force through law through this legislation. So the legislation is giving force to the treaty of which the agreements are a precursor to. My question is really simple. So what happens to agreements once a treaty is passed? Do they then become just historical documents that go away, or do you hear it? Like, I'm trying to figure out how this all connects the dots here, and it's just a bit of a process nerd question, honestly.
It's a very fair question. The intention is that the treaties will supersede the agreements.
Okay.
So essentially replace them.
So once the treaty well, the legislation, in fact, gives force to the treaty, so it doesn't have to come back for approval.
That's right.
Except for the amendments made by the committee that require the treaties to be
prior to. Fair enough. The amendments actually do require it to come back, but the way it was originally presented, the legislation would give force to the treaty, which the agreement is a precursor to, without it having to have come back to be approved by Parliament or any other process. So in essence, the agreements do give force to the legislation does give force to the agreements in an indirect manner. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out the flow of, but now we do have that option between where it's still going to have to come back, right? So that's the change, correct? Am I understanding that appropriately?
You're correct that the treaties, pursuant to those amendments that have been made by this committee, would need to be tabled with Parliament prior to their coming into force.
I'm just trying to go all this around in circles here. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, next I have Monsieur Lemire.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, we have 5 minutes remaining to our time here at the committee. I am just going to take this opportunity to move a motion that I sent to our clerk so that it could be adopted. And I am really surprised. And I'm really surprised by how quickly I received an answer, so you will understand that the second part of this motion could just be dropped, but I'm going to read the first part, that the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs call upon the Government of Canada to clarify how the Crown intends to conduct future negotiations with the Métis of Ontario, Saskatchewan and Alberta with respect to the inherent rights of Section 35 of the Constitution Act of Canada, and to confirm that no overlap will be created as a result of such treaties on First Nations territories without having their free, prior, and informed consent on these issues and on the territories of Quebec. So, standing where I am, and you have heard from Justin Roy, who represents the First Nation of Kebawek, who was referring to the lack of a real recognition of rights. And they answered the question and said that if this bill is adopted on our titles and rights will just simply be glossed over. So I just would like a bit more clarification on this, because I'm just the go-between between the needs of my community and what's happening here. I would also like to facilitate the voting on and the adoption of this bill, but I would like to take back concrete elements of information back to my riding so that I get the backing of First Nations from my region. So I need to receive written information that this will not apply in Quebec, because that's where the Anishinaabe Nation sits. And Mr. Roy talked to us on that. They referred to consultations that were done by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and that was multiple years before the bill. And the Commission recommended that the bill go ahead, and this had an impact on their territories, and this can have security implications on all citizens as well. So it is elements like this where we have overlapping borders where we need clarification. That will be key for me when I'm trying to decide if I'm supporting this bill or not, because right now the chiefs of Algonquin communities in my riding, in my region, are asking me to say no. So I ask your support in adopting this motion. Of course, for the second part, I thank you for the answer, which has already been received. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Batiste.
Yes, and I thank Sebastian for his motion and his sharing with me previous, and I think we've gotten some answers. I'm wondering if we can't table it to the next meeting so that we can refine and amend what we've already provided to you, and then have a conversation about the substance of the first part of it for next meeting. It doesn't appear like we're going to make any progress that draws this C-53 line by line to a debate, so I'm wondering if it's okay if we can discuss this at the next meeting as time is running short, and it'd be nice to get to one vote before we close tonight.
Monsieur Lemire.
Évidemment, ce qui m'intéresse, c'est d'avoir
Well, of course, I have the work that I need to do with the communities. I'll need to go back to them with concrete elements of information before I can take a position, and I don't really have the tools in my possession right now to make a decision. So I'd like to have that dialogue first with them, and for that I will need your support as well. So the motion, I think, is a good way of clarifying what I would like to have to clarify my position. We are talking about issues that might potentially impact Quebec, so if we want to adopt something today, I still need information which I do not have. Thank you.
Okay. So with the motion that we have, what I'm hearing or what I'm looking for is if we can get unanimous consent to bring it back at our next meeting and have the discussion then. So essentially adjourning debate for today. Yeah, exactly. Exactement. Yeah. So we'll have more information and bring it back when we come back. Colleagues, we do. I know people are talking about we're out of time. Technically, we do have 2 hours of resources. I was hoping to get through at least the table today. I know there's lots of discussions. We want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. I do have at this point no more speakers on NDP 5, and I'm wondering if we're willing to move that. And I'll be as bold as asking. Are we going to have the same level of discussion for the remaining amendments on table or on the schedule, or do we think we could move through those in a somewhat reasonable amount of time that we have and still get out earlier than the resources that we have, but beyond 6:30? So I'm looking at the will of the committee. But before we do that, I will first of all say, not having anybody else on my speaking list, I will call the vote on NDP 5 so we can at least conclude that. And then I'll see what the will of the committee is, if we could perhaps dispense with some other CPC 8, 9, and 10. But let's do the vote first on NDP 5. So do we want it, a recorded vote on this? Okay, so I'll turn it over to the clerk for a recorded vote.
Mr. Baptiste?
Against.
Mr. Carr? Mr. McLeod?
No.
Ms. Gainey? Ms. Atwin?
Opposed.
Mr. Schmel?
In favor.
Mr. Vidal?
In favor?
Mr. Pearson? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah, Mr.
In
Pearson.
favor.
Sorry, once more, Mr. Pearson, we missed it.
In favor.
Thank you. Mr. Zimmer?
Favor.
Monsieur Lemire?
Abstention.
Mr. Idlout? Madam Idlout, sorry.
In favor.
Five yeas, 5 nays.
Yeah, this is a situation we haven't come up against, haven't seen since I've taken over chair. I have turned to our clerks and have been given some direction on this, that there is some precedence or direction. The book says, it's very clearly. It's not just, the book tells me what to do as the chair. And I'll, just for reference, it indicates that in casting a vote on a clause of a bill, the chair would vote in the affirmative and on an amendment or sub-amendment, the chair would vote in the negative in order to maintain the status quo and to keep the question open to further amendment. So that's the direction from the book, on an amendment to vote in the negative. And so therefore I vote, or cast my vote in the negative. Okay. So with that, then NDP 5 is defeated. So then we're at this point in time. Would the committee be willing to, how much discussion do we think we need on CPC 8, 9? And I will say that on CPC 10, there is a bit of an issue related to if CPC 8 and 9, anyway, there's an issue we can deal with 10 that could create some inconsistencies in terminology, but really the essence or the main discussion right now would be on CPC 8 and CPC 9. So I'm turning to the committee about timing and if we would have agreement to try to get through this discussion, or do we think we're going to need a lot more time to have the discussion on CPC 8 and 9? Mr. Batiste, I'll go to you first.
Mr. Chair, I think we've had significant discussion and debate around the schedule, which really is just how the stakeholders define themselves and whether we should be defining how they define themselves or within the terms of their title of this. I think a lot of it has been done substantively. I'm asking for us to proceed with the votes on the schedule alone, on division, for the next 3 votes, and then we pick up the next meeting from our discussion on the preamble and the motion by Mr. Lemaire.
Mr. Schmale.
Yeah, Chair, unfortunately I have house duty, so I can't stay too much later. I don't know what the Bloc and NDP are thinking as well on that, but I'm willing if we want to have a vote on CPC 8 and 9, we're fine to go now on that. As you said, number 10 might be a little contentious maybe, so...
Not so much contentious. It depends on the results of 8 and 9, and I can explain that in a minute, depending on where those go.
So do you want to do a quick vote on 8 and 9 then?
Yeah, and then I can explain 10 and see if we can do that and get you back to the House.
Finish up on Monday or whatever? Well, I think... Well, we might win. It depends on the Bloc. I don't know. Well, let's try 8 first, see what the Bloc does. And if the Bloc says that, then we can go down division on the next one. How's that?
Okay, so first of all...
Then we can apply it, yes.
I have to ask, so CPC 8, first of all, we need to have it moved. And so, Mr. Smale, this was yours.
So move CPC 8.
Okay, so we haven't moved. Any debate? I'm hearing move to a vote or on division. So we're
To see what happens.
Okay.
And then depends what happens. We can do a division next
we'll
one.
turn it to the
Mr. Bat-
Oppose.
Mr. Baptiste.
Oppose.
Mr. Carr.
Oppose.
Ms. Gainey.
Contre.
Mr. McLeod.
Oppose.
Ms. Adwin.
Oppose.
Mr. Schmale.
In favor?
Mr. Vidal.
In favor.
Mr. Veerson.
In favor.
Mr. Zimmer.
In favor.
Monsieur Lemire.
Abstention.
Ms. Idlout.
On division the next one.
Ms. Idlout.
Against.
Okay, so
6 nays, 4 yeas.
CPC 8 does not carry. Okay.
So move CPC 8
Nine.
on 9. Sorry, 9.
Okay.
On division.
Negativized on division. Negative on division. Yeah, okay. Thank you. So negative on division. So now, just with 10 quickly, just give me 1 second.
Perhaps I can help you out there, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, Mr. Veerson, I'm just getting some quick
Well,
discussion.
I can. I just have something to say about CPC 10. This is part of a whole series of amendments that I put forward. I asked the drafters to basically change Métis collectivity to Métis communities throughout the bill, and I think this is one of the places where that is not really an. It is just. It is I see how the drafters understood me and did that. They just did a control find collectivity. But this is one of the places where it doesn't necessarily make sense to change it to communities like I did in some of the other places. So I will just not move CPC 10.
Thank you, Mr. Veerson. Okay, so that's good. And then the last question then, that was the last amendment on the schedule. So I'll ask if the schedule shall carry.
Well, on division, but do we have how many more do we have here? We got to go.
That's the end of the schedule. That's the end of the
That's the
schedule.
last one. Last vote.
And so now we're going to.
Okay, now we're going to. Okay, sure. On division.
So
schedule.
it said schedule is carried. Okay. And with that, colleagues, thank you so much. We will resume on Monday with Clause 2 and then work through the remainder. And so thank you so much for your assistance today. And folks, we're adjourned.